This is an oral history recording with Karen Kaivola. Did I say it correctly?
You did.
The interviewer is Kathy Hirsch. Today is May 18th, 2023, and the interview is being recorded at the Conrad Center. For the record, tell us where you were born and where did you live as a child?
Yeah, so I was born in Seattle, Washington in 1957. I lived in the city of Seattle for the first 10 years of my life while my parents were still married. And when they divorced, my mother moved my sister, my younger sister and I, over to Bainbridge Island, which is just to the west of Seattle, where we moved in with her parents in their retirement home, which they had built, and it was large enough to accommodate all of us. So for half of my childhood in Seattle proper, for the other half of my growing up years on Bainbridge Island.
And what was that like?
That was incredibly transformative for me, I would say. It was beautiful natural environment. We had a view of the water, the trees, and the mountains, the Olympic Mountains to the west. It was peaceful, calm, and more stable, I think, than I had known previously. And it instilled in me, I think, in addition to some earlier experiences, a deep appreciation of nature and the sense of grounded peace and calm that I could get from being in nature.
Wonderful as a child to have experienced
Absolutely, yeah.
So your career has been in academia. Tell us how you became associated with DeLand.
Okay, so I did my undergraduate work at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., but I decided I was going to stay in Seattle for my PhD. So the University of Washington was the only school that I applied to. So I finished my PhD, and I was determined never to leave Seattle, never to leave the West Coast. And after 2 years of staying on, and I was at that point directing the undergraduate advising office in the English department at the University of Washington and teaching one class of my own choosing every semester, I wanted the full experience of a faculty member, not this kind of hybrid staff and faculty position. So I decided to go on the job market. And I ended up, after a series of interviews, which are pretty extensive for people in higher education, with an option to go to Iowa or an option to go to Stetson here in DeLand. And I visited both campuses. They both seemed like really good jobs. But it was the people that I met when I was here interviewing at Stetson that made me decide that I could make that leap. So it was difficult for me to make that choice to leave my homeland, so to speak, and to go to a place in the country that I really didn't know very much about. But the people that I met on my interview were so varied and interesting and
who were some of those
inspiring. Well, Carter Colwell, who was the chair of the English department at the time, the Whitticks, Terry Whittick and Rusty Whittick, they spent a lot of time with me answering questions and seemed incredibly lively and intellectually engaged. John Pearson and Ellen Smith were on the hiring committee from the English department that hired me. And I also had the chance to, on that visit, meet Doug Lee, who was the president of Stetson at the time, and Lou Brakeman, who was the provost. Lou Brakeman had actually read one of the fairly obscure books that I had written about in my dissertation, and I was really impressed that a provost would know something about that author. So all things considered, I just decided to make the leap, and I can't say that I never regretted it because it was really hard to make the move, but DeLand and Stetson turned out to be very good places for me.
You said you can't say that you didn't regret it.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, it was moving from, at the time I was living in Seattle now, and so I was living in a big city. I actually like the climate in Seattle. I like the shades of gray. I like the fact that the weather is very temperate. So I moved here in August. It was really, really hot. Hotter than I had really experienced before. And it was a small town. So culturally, it felt really different for me. It was a hard time in my life too, and I'll share this with you given the nature of this project. But when I was 33, I had unexpectedly fallen in love with a woman for the first time. And before that, in my entire growing up period, I never thought that I was anything other than straight, anything other than destined for heterosexual marriage and relationships. And so it really turned my world upside down at a moment that I was making this huge move across country at the same time. So the next few years, it wasn't even just adjusting to living in DeLand, it was adjusting to what this meant for me. What did it mean, you know? And I wrestled with it, I struggled to figure it out. It felt to me like if I didn't walk through this door in this house that had been my life, that I would regret it. And so I ended up stepping away from that relationship, and 2 years later got involved with the woman who became my partner, later spouse, and we've been together 30 years now. So, yeah.
And you stayed at Stetson for how many years?
22.
And what years were those?
1991 until 2013.
That's quite a span.
It was a long period, and it was a really interesting period to be at Stetson. It was immediately after Stetson had separated from the Baptist Convention. And Doug Lee, the president, had initiated an inquiry, campus-wide, open to anybody who wanted to participate, in what the values and commitments of the institution would be if it was no longer aligned, so closely aligned with the Baptist Convention. So I showed up for those conversations. He held a series of dinners. I became a part of that conversation. It was incredibly interesting work. It later morphed into a task force that was looking at it in a more focused way.
What were some of the changes that came about?
Well, it was kind of, you had for Stetson in the past a set of sort of a mission and commitments that reflected, I think, but it's not that it's uniform either. So reflected the values and commitments of the Baptists, and it was becoming a more inclusive university. So I think that one of the reasons that people in the English department in particular were intrigued by me was that I had come from a very progressive city. We were trained in the language of partnership. I used it when I was here, even though I had been, up till that point, involved with men, and still was involved nominally with a man in Seattle, but they thought it meant that I was lesbian. So they sort of projected this identity onto me too. So I think that it was becoming a more diverse place, and I think it had always been that. It just hadn't recognized it. And that was part of the really interesting work that was aligned with this conversation around values at Stetson during the 1990s, another period of culture war, I think, in the United States more generally, but a wrestling with what kind of institution it was going to be, how open it was going to be. And I can tell you that when I came to Stetson, people who were gay and lesbian on the faculty were not open about it. They knew who each other was, and I was soon kind of in that group myself, obviously. But we didn't out each other, and we didn't really talk about it. I know because I ended up working really closely with Doug Lee as his advisor for gender equity, a position that put me on the president's cabinet for a period of about a decade, that this became deeply important to him, in part because he began to realize that some of the faculty who had given so much to the institution, not only from their own lives, but their resources too, were not fully recognized or accepted at the institution. And so he invited me and a couple of other people to be part of work that was focused on educating members of the Board of Trustees at Stetson about the need, for example, for domestic partner benefits, or for a more inclusive institution that would recognize and respond to the diversity of the students too. And he would later tell me that that was some of the hardest work he had done at Stetson. But it was a matter of changing hearts and changing minds. And what I, to this day, deeply admire about him is that he came to that through his commitment to civil rights and through his faith. And that was new to me. The second part of it was new to me. And I was skeptical of that. But he and some of the other people at Stetson began to soften my heart around that as I saw how it led them to be committed to justice and equity and equality for people. And it drove them as well to be deeply connected to the community.
It sounds like you were all going through some kind of evolution.
Yeah. So it was a really interesting period of time. It's not without its bumps in that kind of moment. There were people who had been at Stetson for a long time who had really laid the groundwork for this work. And I would call out in particular Ann Morris, who was also in the English department, Mary Pollock, Nancy Vosberg, Diane Everett. Not all gay people, a mix of gay and straight, but deeply committed to this work as well. So just in the terms of my career, I would just kind of contextualize some of this as, for an academic, you have 6 years before you have tenure, and then you have more security and more responsibility, in a sense, for being a leader at the institution. So when I was tenured in around 1997, I was invited by President Lee to serve in this role that I've been talking about, but I was also invited by the then new dean, Grady Ballinger, who's also been a significant influence in my career and life, to serve as one of the first associate deans in the College of Arts and Sciences. And I sometimes have referred to myself as an accidental administrator, because these things have come my way that I have not sought, and yet I have said yes because I've cared deeply about what it would mean for a woman, what it would mean for a woman who is not straight in a conventional way to be occupying those positions. So when I started on the president's cabinet, I was the only woman in the room. And I was the only one, I used to tell Doug, who had no power, because all the others were vice presidents and had positional authority, resources they could deploy. And I remember one of his responses to me was, well, all power is influence, which I did not believe at the time. But now, after serving as a provost at Augsburg University for 9 years, I would say, yes, I believe it now.
Do you think that Stetson accomplished for all time this progressive attitude or actual putting into practice inclusivity, or do you think it's an ongoing struggle?
I think it's an ongoing struggle, and certainly, I'm fairly new again to Florida, having just moved here in the last year upon my own retirement, but obviously politically the culture wars are flaming up again. I think that we've gained hugely in terms of what was initially domestic partner rights, now is, full marriage equality, which came to my spouse Bonnie and I when we moved to Minnesota, in part because Minnesota, the state, granted those kinds of rights prior to DOMA falling that 2 months later, but within 2 months our marriage was recognized. So I think, and at Stetson, clearly, I think people, well, I don't know if this is clearly, but I think more people would feel more open about being who they are now and bringing their full self to bear on the work that they do for the institution, which I think was one of the challenges before. But I don't think these things are settled so quickly. I do think that marriage rights seem as stable as anything, but there are other kinds of backlashes now, including against trans people, that seem to spark up because that particular struggle has been settled. So I think that institutions, of higher ed are always wrestling, in a sense, with who they're going to be and how they're best going to serve their students and how they're going to prepare their students for the world that the students will need to make their way in. And I think that Stetson has become in some ways more inclusive from what I observe. I'm less involved directly with Stetson now than I have been before. And I think higher ed has been in a really challenging moment anyway, with all kinds of pressures on it. So difficult choices sometimes have to be made that maybe table the values agenda for a period of time. But I've been really fortunate in my own life to be working for two institutions that did hold core values around human dignity, around their mission, and struggled to make things better. One of the legacies I think I carry from my time at Stetson is thinking that Doug Lee was equally committed to achieving a kind of racial equality for members of the community. And I don't think that as much progress has been made around that in this environment or this country. So more work ahead, to be sure.
When you were at Stetson, what was the relationship of the university to the community of DeLand?
Well, I think that what my perception was that the relationship was at times perhaps strained, but it was good. And I think that President Lee set a tone, and there were lots of people at the institution, as there are today too, who are interested in civic engagement and who reach out to members of the community. I know Doug Lee spent a lot of time with leaders in Spring Hill. He had cultivated a relationship with Jefferson Rogers over at the Howard Thurman Center and was working to use whatever influences were in the community in a mutual way so that it would benefit the institution, but the institution could benefit the community. And that is decades work, I think. It's not work that just gets done.
Could you explain, for the record, the Howard Thurman Center and what that means?
Right. Well, Howard Thurman worked with Dr. King, and Jefferson Rogers, who was in that decade directing the Howard Thurman Center, had a commitment to social transformation and equality. He saw Stetson as an institution that was committed to it as well. I think he formed a close friendship and relationship with Doug Lee that helped facilitate the connection between that center, which is dedicated to keeping the legacy of Howard Thurman alive in a particular way. And he was a theologian who wrote a lot of books about equality and the struggle for African American people to achieve equality, and had tremendous connections to an array of people that I think we would never have had the opportunity to bring to Stetson without that kind of relationship.
And who were those people you brought?
Well, so
through him.
People from the civil rights movement like John Lewis, Angela Davis, Stokely Carmichael, Jimmy Carter. I mean, it was just...
All these people came to Stetson?
Oh, yeah.
That must have been a heady time.
It was an amazing time. And we would have these Howard Thurman lectures in the evenings, and people from the community would come, and people from the university would come, and there would be a dinner before the event so that people from the community also had the chance to interact with these amazing people, really. And that's just the short version of the list that I can remember off the top of my head. But there were more, and it was ongoing for years.
So people from the community sat down to dinner with Jimmy Carter?
Right.
My goodness.
Right. I know.
And so it sounds as if the community and Stetson were being educated at the same time through these encounters.
Yeah.
That's quite a impressive.
Well, I think that's education at its best. So you have the classroom book learning, you have the kind of messy reality outside the confines of a carefully crafted syllabus. And you have the kind of human interaction, which is never perfect. It's never ideal. It never goes as far or as fast as some of us would like to see it. But it did, it set a tone, and I think it impacted generations of students who came through Stetson, and probably still does impact them too. I just don't have the direct authority to talk about that, so.
And the community as well.
And the community as well. And I'm aware, for instance, I think that from the time, this is not related to Stetson, but from the time when I was at Stetson, the kinds of stories that the DeLand Beacon might cover, for instance, were not the kind of stories that they might cover today. And I think that is one creating of space for people. It's not that the leaders in the 1990s at Stetson did that work. Other people have done that work, but they helped create the space into which other people could step and do more than they otherwise could have.
So in those days then, did the Beacon cover what was going on with these dinners?
I don't remember if it did. I'm sure that it did. I think what the Beacon's doing now is covering Spring Hill more directly and without Stetson as the intermediary. from what I observe. Again, I'm kind of a new person to this community again in 2023 and beyond.
So what do you feel like your particular legacy might be, your contribution to all this?
Well, I think that for me, I was able to work towards the kind of, justice, equity, inclusion goals while I was at Stetson, both in the classroom and to some extent as an associate dean in the college, to some extent as Doug's gender equity advisor, and then to some extent I was later associate provost for faculty development when a new provost came in. So I was able to perhaps have an impact on people through the kinds of choices about books or texts or how I would evaluate a particular student issue if a student was having trouble. I see that for myself as training for the work that I was called to do at Augsburg University, which is an incredibly diverse, also very mission-driven institution in the heart of the Somali neighborhood in Minneapolis. It's an institution that has transformed itself radically in the last decade, and it has done that without having to sever from its own theological tradition, which is ELCA Lutheran, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and has a deeply grounded in its faith tradition, social justice, equity mission, and now in its undergraduate class, 2/3 or more every year are students of color. So it sees itself in that environment where there's a real outcome gap in the educational K through 12 system. And it might be even more pronounced because it's actually pretty spectacular outcomes or strong outcomes nationally for white students, but not so much for students of color, as filling a need there, as it always has done. It has never educated students of privilege. It has always made its mission to educate the students of farmers or clergymen. And so that institution too is one that pushed me even further, I would say, and in a different kind of leadership position to figure out what I was going to stand for, and personally for me, my mantra is courage, integrity, and humility. And it's important to have all three of them or they get out of whack and out of balance. But had some fairly tough situations to deal with during the time I was provost that I had to navigate, and I could not have done it without having the experience that I had at Stetson first. So I know that for me, Stetson was an incredibly important part in my own coming to be the person who could step into a really challenging position at another institution in another place, and hopefully create these kinds of spaces that I've been talking about for other people, spaces of possibility. I always thought when I was teaching that a teacher's job is to hold up a mirror to a student that shows them what they might be. Not exactly who they are now, but you have to do that too. But you see something in them that maybe they can't see yet for themselves. And I think that being an administrator, even though I started by being an accidental one, by the time I would describe the change as becoming an academic leader when I was at Augsburg, I was able to function in a broader way for the institution in that way and provide that kind of space for the faculty too. And stand up to what needed to be stood up to.
Did you have any students during your time at Stetson who stood out to you with their potential and became true to their potential?
Oh, many, and becoming true to your potential, when you're looking at somebody in an academic context is always a broader human context too. And I don't know if I should name people by name here, but I can think of students who came from what I would call underprivileged backgrounds, who discovered their voices while at Stetson, who practiced in small ways courage of various kinds, who went on to be lawyers, who went on to be college professors, who went on to get MDivs at like the University of Chicago or Vanderbilt and are doing really important work in the world now, who have made contributions to education and rethinking education for young children, who have become fabulous parents. I mean, you know, it's just, there's nothing quite like teaching, and teaching in the age of Facebook, where you actually can see what happens to these young people that you encounter first when they're, you know, 18, 19, and then go on to do sort of amazing things in the world.
It sounds like you've kept in touch with a lot of them.
I've kept in touch with a number of them, yes, yes.
So, in your time at Stetson, are there any particular memories that stick out for you? Good, bad, funny, whatever.
Oh gosh. I'm sure there are lots. You know, I think, oh gosh.
Say at one of these dinners, did you attend these dinners, I think?
I did attend the dinners and I attended the lectures. I think that, you know, I mentioned Jimmy Carter before, and I think what stood out to me about him was his decency and his compassion and his humility. What stood out to me about the religion department at Stetson, and I could name any one of them who has taught in that department who I've crossed paths with, is the expansiveness of their humanity and their commitment to not indoctrination, but to living a life as a decent person and an open-minded person too. So, gosh, you know, these are not the people that I necessarily hung out with. The music school and the concerts were amazing there. I developed, and here's what I would really say, I guess, in response to your question, is that I would have never imagined when I first came to DeLand, A, that it was possible to put down deep roots in such sandy soil, and B, that it would be possible to make the kind of friendships that I did here. And that goes for both my spouse Bonnie and for myself, but you know, we have friends here that we consider family, and it's why we returned to Florida to retire, is to be in the network of people who we know we could call at 2 a.m. and they would show up. And if they called us at 2 a.m, we would show up too. And that doesn't happen, or it hasn't happened in my life until you pass a certain threshold of knowing someone or going through something with them. And for me, it didn't happen until I'd been at Stetson about 15 years. And so fast forward to being there 22 years and making the decision to leave, and it was heart-wrenching, right? I mean, there were tears, mine and other people's. And I think that, I almost hate to say this here, but one of the most meaningful things that somebody said to me when they found out that I was leaving is that they felt that the soul of the institution was leaving, or the faculty member who epitomized that to them was leaving. And so that is a really high compliment. I don't know that I deserve it. I keep it in my mental toolbox or my mental chest to remind myself of, you know, what I aspire to even when I don't live up to it. And I guess, I don't know that I was able to function like that, you know, at Augsburg, but I was involved in so many things at Stetson that if I had more time to think it through, I'm sure I would think of all kinds of people who've just been incredible to me. You know, I worked, as I said, with Dean Ballinger, Grady Ballinger, who, when Bonnie and I got married in 2008 in Vancouver, Canada, with many of our friends from Stetson, flew across the country to join us, and we didn't expect that anybody would. We thought we'd just pull over some witnesses in Stanley Park, and that would be that, but we had all kinds of friends who said, well, we're gonna come there with you. And so we rented a house in Seattle for a week, and anybody who wanted to join us was welcome, and you know, that was a beautiful thing. But you know, Stetson I think, enabled me to form those kinds of relationships in part because it's in a small town like DeLand. You know, the difference, you know, Augsburg, I said, very deeply mission driven, challenged me in all kinds of ways. I'm deeply grateful for that experience too, but it's in the middle of a city, and so it seems in some ways people live all over the place, and they live in all the ring suburbs, or they live down in Northfield where, you know, Carleton and other, you know, universities are, St. Olaf are. So they're more dispersed. I know there's friendships among the faculty, but here, because it is a small town, I think and we all came from different places, that the opportunities for friendship were really remarkable. You know, in Florida, it seems so often that everybody comes from somewhere else, although obviously there are some native Floridians too. In Minnesota, even with those deadly cold winters, you know, a lot of families stay there, or if people leave, they come back. So people tend to have really deep relationships there, which I really admire. But if you're a newcomer and you're the provost, it's not the same kind of opportunity to make friends. In fact, you can't really afford to do that at school in the same way. Friendly with a lot of people, but not the kind of friendships that I was able to form at Stetson. Or the other thing I would say is that my ideas about leadership were definitely developed at Stetson. And many times while I was at Augsburg, I thought about the leadership of Doug Lee, who I've mentioned many times, the leadership of Grady Ballinger, others that I worked with as well. Beth Paul was the provost that I worked with. And they were sort of the stars I navigated by in various combinations for what I could, you know, pull or remember from their strengths. And that's something, because as Bonnie, who loves me dearly, said when we went, there are ways in which you will fail at this job, probably, and in ways you haven't before. And she was right, you know, she was. But that's just part of being a leader in such a public way, is that your failures become more public too. But I think that Stetson helped me develop the strength to manage that.
What do you think some of those failures were?
Oh gosh. I think it took me too long. I was trying to balance when I first arrived the importance of listening to people and getting to know a different culture and not assuming it was like the one that I came from. I think that led me to postpone some decisions that I should have made sooner. I think sometimes it was like standing in a hurricane and needing to make decisions about things that just hit you all of a sudden. And it's hard to imagine ever that there is a perfect decision to be made in the context of that kind of moment. And I've always, I think, tried to resolve conflicts or problems in a way that maintains dignity for everyone. And that sometimes is very difficult to do. I think I consistently did my best, but you don't stay in a position like that for 9 years without alienating people too. So that was a new lesson for me. I don't know, because I tend to be kind of diplomatic and a pragmatist more than an ideologue. But I think I encountered various forms of narcissism in a deeply humble community that I was not necessarily prepared for, and took a toll. Took a toll on them, took a toll on me too. So I know that sounds really abstract, but
I think many people can relate to dealing with narcissism.
Yeah.
And it's everywhere,
Yeah.
right? It's not just unique to small towns.
Right.
But they're, I'd like to ask you how what kind of advice you would give to a young person today.
Yeah. Well, I think it would not be that different from the kind of advice that I tried to give my students, which was to take small steps, even when it feels difficult. Around things that are difficult for you, because it's like working out. You build strength, and you never know how that strength is going to serve you later on. I think there's, at least in my own life, there have been only a few pivotal moments where I was faced with a decision that would really change my life in some ways. And so I tended to say yes to those moments, and my advice is to say yes. And I guess I would say, especially in this moment that seems so divisive and polarizing, and in some deeply problematic ways, we seem more aware that truth is something we can't take for granted, that to never give up the sort of struggle to see things clearly, and to be committed to community as well as to yourself.
There seem to be a lot more challenges now in terms of diversity, and people, we're in an information age as never before with access to all kinds of technology, which is challenging and has good and bad points. So what do you see as the challenges for people coming into the field of education now that didn't exist when you did?
Oh gosh. I think that what is similar is that education at its best, at least in my lifetime, has always been about preparing students for an unpredictable future. And so part of what education needs to do in a time of even more rapid acceleration of change is to double down on what we can do to prepare students for that kind of speed of change. And it doesn't, in some ways, to people of my generation, feel even human. It's like technology is sort of taking over. We read in the headlines about artificial intelligence and how that will displace workers. I think that the more that one can cultivate both some expertise in some field, but also the capacity to change directions, you will be well served by it. And I'll ground this in a personal story. My father became a printer for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer because he thought that that job would never change. He saw what happened to his own father, who was a fisherman in Alaska, when that work dried up. And so one of his concerns always was stability and employment. He wanted me to be a nurse, which I did not want to be, but I thought that being a college professor would provide the same kind of employment stability that he had sought, because I thought, well, there will always be a need for education. And yet, what it means to be a college educator, and high school educator too, has changed radically in the course of my lifetime. So I don't know that it's clear yet what those kinds of skills will be, or if they will be the same for everyone. I think that there is a need for the kind of job preparation training that community colleges or the former community colleges do, as well as other institutions. And there is a need for people who are more conversant with the centuries-long debates, whether they're political, economic, or social justice, that have been going on in the world for centuries. And I think that we are well served by having some acquaintance with those as well. So that doesn't give a sort of practical response to educators. So much of what made teaching attractive to people in the past has changed radically. The conditions under which teachers teach has changed. There are challenges in the classroom with students who come from families that might be polarized, and somehow you have to create an experience for all of them. It requires a lot of somebody to be able to navigate that space. I think that being present with your students and being authentic and to take risks, even in being able to be who you are in your interaction with students, model something about human interaction that people take away that is remembered long after you forget what the actual subject matter is. So if you model acceptance, tolerance, inclusiveness in a classroom, you model something that is going to be, I think, increasingly important in the United States and in the world.
So it's the framework, it's the attitude.
Yeah, it is. And I know that for somebody who is a teacher, it's not the toolkit, but it is the framework within which you figure out what the toolkit is for what you are teaching.
And currently, under the administration in Florida, interpretation and context, and certainly inclusivity, is eggshell walking territory.
Right.
So that's a big change. That's a radical change, I think, for educators in public schools.
Yeah. Well, we are in a moment now in Florida where I think that the politics create a chilling effect, I mean, like a deeply chilling effect on what teachers, what libraries, what other professionals in education feel that they can do. The story, part of the story that at least I hear, where parents feel that their children become educated and change. Well, education has always been about change. My father said the same thing to me when he put me on the plane to go to Georgetown. He said, "Are you sure you want to do this? It might change you and create distance between us." And for a short time in my 20s, I think it did, but I don't think it did in the long term either. So within families, outside of families, how we talk to each other or don't talk to each other anymore, how we live in our own bubbles, and it's tempting to do it because we feel more comfortable there. But the importance of having real dialogue with real people on the ground, not just politicians and the news cycle, I think is incredibly important too, but incredibly difficult because
bubbles
it doesn't
can be burst at any time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you see, how would you like to be remembered?
Oh, gosh. I guess I'd like to be remembered as somebody who was a decent colleague, a good friend, and a compassionate partner. I think that I'd like to be remembered as somebody who did create space for other people, as some other really important people in my life created those kinds of spaces for me of growth and opportunity. I'd like to be remembered as somebody who wasn't afraid to change her mind, who would consider the evidence, who continued to be committed to growing and learning throughout her life, not just when she was in school. And who didn't seek power for power's sake, but felt called to do what good she could do in the positions that she took.